Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we have a very special guest. We have Tom Chivers. He's an author and the award-winning science writer for Semafor. His writing has appeared in The Times, The Guardian, New Scientist, Wired, CNN, and more. He's also the co-host of the Study Show podcast alongside Stuart Richie, and his books include The Rationalist Guide to the Galaxy and How to Read Numbers. His newest book, available now, is called Everything is Predictable: How Bayesian Statistics Explain Our World. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And so in Tom's book, he writes, here's a realistic example with plausible numbers. You are going for a breast cancer screening. You know that if a woman has cancer, the mammogram will correctly identify it 80% of the time. It's 80% sensitive, and miss it under 20%. If she doesn't have cancer, it will correctly give the all clear 90% of the time. It's 90% specific, but give a false positive 10% of the time. You get the test. It comes back positive. Does that mean there's a 90% chance you've got breast cancer? No. With the information I've given you, you simply don't know enough to say what your chances are. What you need to know is how likely you thought it was that you had breast cancer before you took the test. One simple way of guessing that is finding out what percentage of women your age have breast cancer at any given time. Let's say it's 1%. To keep things concrete, let's imagine 100,000 women get tested. Of those 100,000, 1%, 1,000, actually have cancer. Of those 1,000, the test will correctly diagnose 800 of them, 80%. But will falsely give the all clear to 200. Of the 99,000 who don't have cancer, it will correctly give the all clear to 89,100, but falsely diagnose cancer in 9,900. So now you can tell. You walk into an oncologist's office and get a positive mammogram. Of the 10,700 women who got a positive result, 800 actually had cancer. So your chance of really having cancer, if you get a positive result in this case, is 800 divided by 10,700, or 0.07%, about 7%. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard this a million times already. Bayesian statistics is incredibly counterintuitive. You also mentioned the example about the COVID test. Obviously, that with COVID tests, they have a 99% accuracy rate. And so when you think about these things, you think, okay, there's no way that I get a positive result, and essentially that it's false. Like the chances must be infinitesimally low. So, okay, Tom, with obviously, as we talked about before, with or in as much English as possible, can you actually explain to us why Bayesian statistics is so counterintuitive before even getting into like who Bayes was, why obviously he thought this way, but just how is it that people can even start to kind of like intuit this, or if that even is possible? Because for us, this is like, wait, this doesn't make sense.
No, I know. I mean, this is why I love it, right? Because it's like, it seems like sorcery. I mean, like, if someone comes to you and says like, this test is 99% accurate. So, okay, so I take the test, I get a positive result. And they say, so what surely there's a 99% chance that the test is right. No, right? What mad language are you talking? This is crazy, right? But I've been trying to work out a way of making it easier to understand, all right? A sort of example that can make people sort of grasp it more easily. Imagine me, Tom Chivers, go for a particular medical test, right, for a condition that and we know that test is pretty accurate. It is 99% of the time that it gives you 99. It only gives the wrong answer one time in 100, right? So there's only a 1% chance of seeing a wrong answer on any particular test. Now I go and take that test. I get a positive result. You say, well, surely it's 99% likely that the test is positive. But what if I now tell you it was a pregnancy test, right? And you think, okay, so now what's more likely? That I, Tom Chivers, a 43-year-old man, am pregnant, or that this was the one time in 100 that the test was wrong? You see what I mean? You're actually, what you've got to do is compare not just the chance that you would see a false positive, you've got to compare it to the alternative possibility of the test, that the real answer the test is giving you is right. And that depends on how, like, it's pretty unlikely for 43-year-old guys to be pregnant on the whole. It's not, you've got, if you heard that was that, you think, oh, right, okay, so yeah, I know the test is pretty good, but I got to say, I don't think any test is that good. I think it's probably more likely that this is the one in 100 than that Tom over there is expecting twins, So that's the way I try. Like, you've got to take into account just how likely things are before you do this. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. And this isn't how a lot of people are trained. This isn't how we often think. And this isn't how, like, science on the whole doesn't work like this. when doctors who do medical tests forget to think like this or aren't trained to think like this and often get it wrong, it's not just us like laymen, lay people, but it is vital. Nothing. If you want to know how something is likely, how likely something is to be true, like how likely it is that I have cancer, how likely some scientific hypothesis is true, given that I've just done an experiment, whatever, you need to think about how likely it was before. And that was the great insight of Bayesianism. And without that, you just cannot say how likely something is.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us about the fundamental difference between the Bayesians and the frequentists? Because for the most part, when people think of statistics, they just think of, okay, there's a 1 in something chance that this would happen based on the frequency of it, right? And we would think, okay, well, why would the Bayesians challenge that? That makes a lot of sense, because the frequentists would say, and most people I think would agree, is that frequencies are based in reality, whereas Bayesianism is a little bit more subjective.
Right. Okay. So exactly that. So frequentism is how statistics is done in science. And if you ever heard people talk about statistics, a statistically significant result or whatever, that's they're talking about they're being frequentist about it. What that actually is, people get it confused a lot. They think it means how, that something is statistically significant, and I'm doing air quotes there for people listening. It means that that this is actually a significant result. It's important. It matters. That's not what it means. It means it's fairly unlikely to happen by chance. That's all it means. And that is what it's like the test thing. This is how likely I would be to see this result on a test, but not necessarily how likely it is that that the test is correct. So the thing about Bayesianism is that because it brings in those priors, the example I gave in the book is of a coin toss, right? If you flip a coin and it lands head, if you flip a coin, you catch it and you cover it like that. You don't know what it's landed, and then you ask someone, what's the chance that this coin is heads? If they could go down to sort of two routes here. They could say either, well, it's either heads or tails. There's no probability about it. It is what it is, and I don't know what it is, but it is what it is. Or they could say it's 50-50. I don't know.
Right.
Okay. The 50-50 is sort of a Bayesian approach, if you like. That is saying statistics and probability is a statement about my ignorance about the world. It's a subjective thing. I don't know what the coin is, and like you could look at the coin and see what it is, but still I don't know, and it's still 50-50. The frequentist thing is there is, like, when I say that there is a 50% chance a coin comes up heads, I mean that if you flipped a coin an infinite number of times, it'll come up 50% heads. Whereas for Bayesian saying that, all the Bayesian means is my best guesses. I don't have enough information to be more accurate than that. When the coin flips, I don't know how much power you put into the flip. I don't know how, what the air is. I can't calculate the air resistance. So all I can say is it's probably 50-50. So that's the great difference between Bayesianism and frequentism, is that Bayesianism is saying is subjective. We're just saying, we're admitting that probability isn't a real thing out in the world. It's just our best guess about the world, and everything is all subjective. The trouble is with that is that people don't like it very much. So scientists want to pretend is unfair, but the scientists want to say they are doing objective science, that this is a real thing. When we're doing statistics about science, we're talking about objective facts. But obviously that can't ever really be true, because we don't really know that we're not hallucinating. We don't really know that you can never be certain about anything. There is no true objectivity. There are better and worse guesses. There is having more and having less information. But ultimately, everything in statistics and probability and life, right? All our decisions are fundamentally uncertain. We are trying our best to understand things and what statistics are and what probability is. And really, like, when, me saying anything at all, like, I think my wife will want, some jewelry for Christmas or whatever. These are best guesses about the world. There's no objective facts. There's no eternal truth. There's just better and worse guesses, and that's sort of the insight of Bayesianism.
I see. So that makes me think of something. I'm not sure if this exactly applies, but Leon recently, he had a blood test.
Yeah.
2 blood tests, in fact. After the first blood test,
I love that you're bringing up this.
No, I love it.
Yeah, sure.
So after the first blood test, the doctor told him, okay, based on these results, it seems that you actually may have a fatty liver, and you may have to, change your diet and curb your drinking, that sort of thing. However, something that he thought, and I also thought myself, is that, okay, well, what did you do recently? You know, before you had that blood test, is it
Mhm.
possible that perhaps maybe you just happen to have a bad week of food, a bad week of, let's say, drinking,
Which I did.
and yes,
Yeah.
Mhm.
and then, oh, maybe that influenced the results. And
Mhm.
maybe you should get another blood test, because the blood test, the results of that are dependent on, you know, what's going on at the very moment that the blood test is taken.
Mhm.
Although that should be reliable, that is something that we should rely on. We don't have much else to rely on. But
Mm.
then what did you find out with the second blood
Yeah,
test?
yeah, yeah. So, and,
Yeah.
and I want to just put in another thought here, because this is so interesting that you're bringing this up. And so the way I tend to go when I go to the doctor's office, the way I
Mm.
tend to think of it is very black and white and very concrete. So my thinking is it's kind of 50-50. Well, I don't even think about it in terms of like probability, but I just think it's either this or it's this, right? So my
Yeah.
thinking is, okay, great. So I'm going to get this blood test, and it's either I do have a fatty liver and I have to go on a strict diet, or I don't, right? There are no other options. That's it. It's one or the other. And I'm kind of worrying, right? And I'm ruminating. I'm like, oh my God, fuck, like it seems like such a high probability.
Yeah.
And then so, okay, I go back the second time. So I do a full, what is it, abdominal ultrasound, which took like half an hour. And then on top of that, I get another blood test. And then so I talk to the doctor the second time, and the doctor's like, oh no, he's like, this is just like all precautionary. It's not even like that big of a deal. And I'm thinking, what the fuck, man? I'm over here thinking like, shit, it's like 50-50, you know?
Mm.
And then, yes, come to find out, he's like, no, everything is normal. You don't have to come see me anymore.
Yeah, yeah. So, I'm not sure if that exactly is, if it applies though, that example.
Mhm.
Because one interesting thing is that I like to think of blood tests in that sort of Bayesian way, like as sort of
Their information.
sub,
They're new
yeah,
information to add to, like, so you like what the whole point of Bayesianism is, right, is that you have your best guess of the world. It's like a prediction of the world. You before you go and have any blood tests whatsoever, if you think my lifestyle's broadly pretty good, and you know I drink but I don't drink that much, and you know I get some exercise, I go to the gym, whatever, you might be thinking it's probably not that likely that I have a fatty liver. So, but
Mhm.
then you go and get a test, and I see your lipid. I assume it's to do with lipid levels in the blood or
Yep.
something like that. Yeah.
Yep.
And they say, oh, I'm worried about the fat in your liver, and you
Mhm.
go, well, that seems weird, because I'm not the sort of person who normally would, but you know, this now, so to put made up numbers on it, you might say, like, before I thought it was 5% likely that I had, you know, so I'm a guy in my early 30s or something like
Mhm.
that, and you know, and it's and I'm in pretty good shape, and these things are, you know, you look like you're in pretty good shape. So you know, so you know, so you're pretty relaxed about it to begin with. Then you go and have this test. Oh, balls. Okay,
Mhm.
but you still think, you know, tests aren't perfect. I happened to have eaten a lot of burgers that week, and we went out with someone's like stag do, so I went out and got completely hammered 3 nights or whatever.
Mhm.
And so that week, I'm maybe that does that affect things in the short term? So I will raise my subjective probability, my best guess, that maybe it's like 45%. Like, that's enough to worry about. I'll go and get it checked out again.
Mhm.
And then the doctor says, oh no, you know, it's fine. The numbers have gone down. You can move yourself back down. And that's like, your point, Leon, that, you know, you sort of think it is or it isn't, or it won't or it will, you know, the sort of stuff. The beauty of the Bayes equation, the Bayes model of looking at the world, is you don't need to do that. You can say, I think, you know, you don't have to be certain about anything. You can say, I think it's quite likely that this thing is true, or I think it's not very likely. You can put percentage numbers on it if you like, but you can sort of move between probably this truth, but I could be convinced otherwise. And you get more information, you move towards it, you move a different way, and then you get different information, you move the other way, and you sway with the evidence as it comes in, rather than having to say, I believe this thing, I believe this thing, I believe this thing, and then either defending that against new evidence, or uprooting everything you believe to change it later on. So I think that's quite a good example, actually. It's you had a baseline belief of, I probably don't have fatty liver problems. You get some new information, you change your belief somewhat with that new information, you go and seek new information on the top of it because you're not convinced, and you move along to a point where you find yourself in a place where, like, I probably don't need to do anything, I'm happy with the information I have, I'm relaxed, there's nothing, no new changes need to be made. That seems
Mhm.
a quite Bayesian process to me.
Yeah, I love that. And so this makes me think. So I've had several patients. So I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist. So I've had several patients in the past. Yeah. And so we do, we try as best as we can to quantify emotions. Obviously, this is a very subjective thing. Some people are like, yeah, whatever, I'm cool with ballparking it. And other people like really fucking hate it. And so with the people who hate it, they would say, but this is stupid. Like, how do you quantify emotions? And so as I was going through reading about Bayes and reading kind of the subjectivity involved, I was thinking about some of them. And I'm wondering, when you're thinking about it, it in terms of like what's concrete or what's subjective, right? I guess what are we actually doing here? Are we getting away from objectivity? And I guess the real question is that okay? Because I mean, who's to say? And I'm sure that you've gotten this question multiple times, and God knows from how many people. But I guess who's to say then, like, how accurate are our priors? Then, you know, it's like if we're just like kind of like, this is the argument here. How do we know we're not just pulling numbers out of the air, right? So like with my patients, they would say, well, how do I know that I'm not just saying, oh, I'm 75% anxious, but I'm not actually, but I'm actually 40%, right? Which is actually a great argument. I've actually appreciated that argument. So they're like how, who's to say, right? Like who's to say that it's 75 as opposed to 40? And who's to say that I actually feel substantially better after like doing this worksheet and this process, as opposed to like maybe only feeling mildly better, right? Like it's really hard to actually say. So I wonder what you would say to somebody who says that like, but yes, but the data, the numbers are supposed to be objective. And if we start getting into subjective territory, then it becomes kind of chaotic. And who's to say that it won't just become a free for all where people aren't just plucking numbers out of the air?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things in this. So the subjective thing, right? You can pretend they're objective if you like, but nothing is objective. You know, there is in the end, there is no true standing out. You know, every bit of information you get from the world will be information you get through your senses. You cannot stand outside yourself and be like God, viewing down and think, oh, so it actually, you know, this particular test was correct, or this particular theory is true. You have to do your best to assess the world through your senses. So there will always be subjectivity. That said, people think subjective means therefore anything goes and all guesses are equally good. But like, imagine two people with different best guess priors, right? One person thinks they're two people playing dice, right? And one person says, I think there's a 1 in 6 chance that this dice will come up 6. The other person thinks there's a 5 in 6 chance this dice will come up 6. Most of the time, the first guy will, you know, if will be close, will be right more often, right? And if there was like make bets, if that, you know, if you go and say, I'll bet you, so the first guy should say to the other, I'll bet you 50-50 that this one won't come, you know, this one won't come up 1 in 6. And they'll go, oh, I'll definitely take that bet. The first guy will win more money than the second guy, right? That will be, you know, subjective doesn't mean anything goes. There can be better and worse subjective priors, but it is still true that, to slightly change my metaphor here, right? But you know, let's imagine I've been talking about coins instead of dice. Like, if someone's flipping a coin, normally they say, what's the chance it's 50-50? If that person is just a friend of mine and they're trying to toss a coin to see whose round it is or something, you know, really normal situation, I go, oh, it's 50-50, you know. But if that person is like David Blaine or something, right? You know, or if there's, or if I know it's the owner of the world's largest collection of double-headed coins, you know, then I don't think it's 50-50. I think you're trying to trick me. You know, I think there's there was actually Michael Shermer, I went on the Michael Shermer podcast recently. I think you know that, and he told a story about James Randi. You know, James Randi,
of course, I love him.
Yeah, skeptic, late lamented. And he said, like, he had some, as I understood it, there was a trick where he put like a card into one of 4 envelopes, and he like shuffled it around and he holds up to someone. He says, what's the probability that the card is in this envelope? And the audience would go, oh, it's 25%. And you go, no, it's not. It's 100%. I'm a stage magician. Like, I am tricking you. So like, it is absolutely. It is still, you know, there is no objective fact about how likely it is that 25% chance that there's a 25% chance it's in it. That's just your best guess of how likely it is to be in any one. On the so specifically on the CBT thing, I mean, I agree that I happen to write a lot about psych measurement issues a lot, and it's I mean, there's a lot of bad measurement in psych, isn't there? Really, there's a lot of sort of dodgy, especially in the sort of science side of it, as opposed to the you know, and what does it mean if, so, you know, someone scores 34 on a depression questionnaire and they're healthy, and they score 35 and they've got depression? You know, that's not, these random cutoffs are a bit, you know, like, but I guess.
And by the way, the other interesting thing, just really quickly to add this, is that it's also interesting that when it comes to the scales, a lot of people like fuck up the self-reports for whatever reason. So just because a person scores one thing doesn't even mean that they're being honest about it. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, of course, I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about here. Like, you know, if someone says I'm 40% anxious today, and is that comparable to someone else? You know, is there some meaningful thing? Is it some true readout of some inner like dial marked, or, you know, marked anxious? I mean, obviously not. It's a sort of, but on the other hand, I guess there is usefulness if, you know, like someone else saying 40% might be the same internal, I don't know what that means, right? What does that mean? But like, it might sort of compare in some way to someone else's 75% or someone else's 10%. I don't know. But I guess if someone one day says they come in and they say they're 40% and the next week they say they're 75%, you can use it to track changes in a person. I would be very surprised if it's particularly useful in like comparing between people, because people would have such different subjective experiences of these things. I mean, it's just anything. It's like getting people to compare, to like self-report internal states, and it's so messy and it's so like affected by how you're like, you know, we tell people, this is something I've been thinking a lot about with mental health. You know, there are a couple of people writing about mental health awareness, and actually there's a risk when you make people too aware of mental health, they start interpreting normal low mood as symptoms of a mental health condition, and you need to be really careful. You're not, you know, I don't want to say putting ideas in people's minds, but, you know, making them overinterpret symptoms. But that's slightly away from Bayesianism. It's just into the noisy, messy problems of getting good data from psychological studies and behavior and the whole thing.
Actually, I think that really relates to Bayesianism. So what's so interesting, and there's a therapist on Twitter named Jonathan Shelder. He always points this out. So he's like, you know, if we're having a narcissism epidemic, right? Why is it that narcissistic personality disorder, why does it only have a prevalence rate of 1 to 3%, and we have this epidemic?
Yeah, I mean, all these things. There's a loneliness epidemic at the moment, and if you look, I find it really hard to find good evidence that there's more lonely people. You know, that loneliness is more common now than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I think it's just it's obviously bad to be lonely, and it's obviously lots of people are, because lots of people live, you know. But I don't get the impression people are living on that it's well. I find it really hard to find good evidence. It just becomes one of these things we all sort of assume and talk about, you know, like that, and that becomes people. I hadn't heard of a narcissism epidemic, but people love to call things epidemics. And for me, the word epidemic means a rapidly increasing, possibly exponentially increasing thing that is, you know, a problem that society has had that has got exponentially worse in recent years. I mean, I could get like the diabetes or obesity. I can see you using it because you can actually see that that's got more prevalent, and it's easier to say. But I think a lot of the time it's just used to mean a thing that I think is bad, and I worry that it's not being that no one's actually doing the work to show that it's got more prevalent. But this is again I'm slightly ranting about different things rather than the stuff that's in the book.
No, yeah, it's okay. And then, so again, going back to the frequentists, I mean, you mentioned that obviously Bayesianism is, I guess, sort of countercultural in this case. So, I mean, in the way that you outlined it, it seems pretty intuitive. I mean, you know, both counterintuitive and intuitive. It seems like it makes a lot of sense, especially, I'm assuming there's also a way to kind of like look at the data and say, well, okay, if let's say the kind of understanding is that it's a 7% rate, most of the time, most people will not have a positive test if they retest, right? So how come you think, what is like the discrepancy here between the frequentists and the Bayesians, and why isn't Bayesianism more popular or prominent in the scientific community?
Okay, so I mean, the reason a lot of it is that in the early, the Reverend Thomas Bayes, he lived in the first half of the 18th century, and he was the first. There'd been a lot of people thinking about probability before then, but it had been all about sort of, you know, how likely am I to see three sixes on three dice or whatever, or like how do we work out the likelihood of different route, you know. So it was all very much, and this is the crucial difference. It was how likely am I to see a result, for example, three dice, given some hypothesis, three sixes, given some hypothesis, for instance, that these dice are fair. Bayes' thing was doing this opposite thing that we've been talking about, which was how likely is my hypothesis, for instance, that these dice are fair, or more realistically, like my COVID vaccine works, or whatever, you know, after I've got some result, like I've rolled three sixes, or I've got 10 people with COVID in my placebo group and only one in the other, you know. So, which I think most statisticians and scientists would say is, this is what we're trying to do, right? This is we are trying to find out how likely things are, how to make best guesses about the world. The trouble was, I mean, there were various troubles with it, right? Firstly, as the squishy subjective nature of it, you know, like saying we are finding out things out about the world. We need to say, this is what I believe. I believe that my COVID vaccine works. Therefore, and I have to then integrate any data with that. It's like, well, it feels a bit weird to, you know, to be like, yeah, I believe it, so let's include that in the data. You know, that feels very subjective and squishy and weird. There's also technical problems of like, you know, where do you get, if you're going to do the mass, where do you get these priors from? I mean, there were something it's a bit mathsy and technical, so I'll try not to go into it in any detail, but like if you say you're ignorant about, say you're pulling balls out of an urn and they're either black or white, and say there's 500 in the urn, whatever. Are we saying that, if we say you're ignorant about the ratio of black balls to white, are you saying you're equally ignorant that each one will be black or white, or you're equally ignorant over whether, it could be 0 whites and 500 blacks, or 0 blacks and 500 whites, or any mix in between? Because those are totally different. Because if you're saying each ball is equally likely to be 50-50, then you're almost certain to get about half, like flipping a coin.
Right.
Whereas if it's the other way, then any distribution is equally likely. And so people pointed out in the early years of, sort of 100 years or 200 years after Bayes, like, when you say we are ignorant, what do we mean? There are different kinds of ignorance. It's really complicated. And it wasn't until many years later that people worked out how to sort of talk in terms of higher levels of ignorance and all this sort of stuff, what we call hyperparameters. But also, I think really fundamentally, in the early 20th century, this guy, Ronald Fisher, super brilliant genius guy who, he's the one who came up with all these tests, like the statistical significance, his idea, basically. Loads of there's, if you go on Wikipedia and look for stuff that Fisher came up with, there's like pages of it. It's just he also a bit of a dickhead by all accounts, but he basically hated Bayesianism, as did other sort of titans of statistic around that period, and it was mainly because because of this subjectivity, this sort of idea that we can put in our own beliefs into science and that be part of the numbers we run. And I simply, I get why that feels weird. I do understand that, but I think fundamentally, eventually, you just got to bite the bullet, right? You got to bite the bullet and say, science is, like, knowledge is to some extent subjective, and that is not the same as saying that there are shades of gray in everything, but that is not the same as saying that all shades of gray are the same color. Right? Some are very dark and some are very light. They are different shades, but nonetheless, there is no black and white. There is no pure objectivity. There is no, this is just true and this is just false. It's best guesses, and the only person who can make those best guesses is you, because you're never going to see anybody else's brain,
Isn't science also just a bunch of priors anyway? I mean, if we look at it as a field of progress.
Isn't a hypothesis a prior in a sense?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
and even a theory, technically, even though it's strongly supported, is technically a prior. Yeah,
absolutely. Like, I mean, a hypothesis. I mean, I tell you what, this is interesting. The probably jumping ahead a bit, but in the sort of history of perception studies, so studies of like human perception and how we see the world, they and I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit, but the idea is that we are predicting the world and updating those predictions with our information from our senses in a very Bayesian way. The people who came up with that, especially this guy Richard Gregory, mid 20th century sort of physiologist, I think, scientist, and he explicitly made the comparison with scientific hypotheses. We are going out and and what a hypothesis? Yes, it is a prediction, a prior. Like, I think my hypothesis is that, I don't know, hammers will drop down when I drop them. It will hit the ground first. If I drop a hammer and a helium balloon, the hammer will hit the ground first. Now, I'm very confident in that prior. It is a very confident prediction, but nonetheless, it is a prediction. I can test it and I can see whether it comes true. If it didn't come true, I'd be really bloody surprised, and that would be I'd have to really significantly update my beliefs about the world, or at least my beliefs about that particular hammer. So it is. But you're absolutely right. These things are priors. And the point is, with all of them, you get your prior, you get new information, that updates your data, and that updates your prior to posterior, which always makes people snigger a bit, but nonetheless, your posterior. And then your that becomes the new prior. That becomes the new thing for the new information. You're just constantly updating, constantly, hopefully moving closer to the truth, getting more information, which guides you towards a better understanding of the world. So. I don't know, something, do you remember, have you heard of a thing called, an essay by Isaac Asimov called The Relativity of Wrong? It's a brilliant essay. I remember I loved it. I read it, well, it must be 20 or 30 years ago I read it now. No, 20 years, I'm not that old. But yeah, he said, like, when people thought that the world was flat, they were wrong. And when people thought that the world was a sphere, they were wrong. But if you think that they're just as wrong as each other, because actually, the sphere is not quite a sphere. It's an oblate spheroid. It's it slightly bulges at the edges, at the middle rather. But if you think those two things are just as wrong as each other, then you're wrong with them both put together. Like the Earth, to me, I look out and the Earth is kind of flat. Like it is pretty good. If you model the Earth in your mind as flat, you'll do pretty well. You won't fall off the edge ever. But if you want to model, if you want to fly a plane from one place to another, you'll get closer to the truth if you model it as a sphere. And if you want to model, you have like your GPS satellites flying around, you'll do even better if you model it as this. So you get, it's not that there is a simple right answer and that everything else is wrong, and we're all just postmodern, that there's these different truths that people share. Each one of these things is like you're getting closer to the reality. There is you can't ever get there, but you are making a model of the world, and you can make that model ever more accurate. There's a phrase, the map is not the territory. Like I have a map of the world in my brain. It's not the same thing as the world, but I can make it more or less accurate, that's what the I forget exactly why I started this story, but I thought it was very interesting. So there you go. That was the whole point of Bayesianism, is that you're just trying to get closer to the right answer. You'll never get there, but you can be more accurate as you get more information.
Yeah, and then in terms of priors, I mean, one would argue that you absolutely need them, because otherwise you're just taking in every new piece of or potential new piece of information as just evidence for some particular hypothesis, or strong evidence rather for some particular hypothesis. So I like the fact that you mentioned, you mentioned the James Randi example, but let's say we're a magician, right? So if people were just more or less focused on the evidence and there were no priors, let's say we could go into the Humean notion of, whatever it was something along the lines about something miraculous requires extraordinary evidence, something like that, right? So you can say to yourself, without the particular priors, without some objective experience or some subjective experience or some subjective notion of, which is both subjective and objective, obviously, of how the world is supposed to work. I mean, essentially, you're just going to fall for any new piece of information. So if a magician tries to show you that, hey, or a medium or something, like, hey, here's the supernatural thing, and you're like, oh my God, this completely upends my worldview. That doesn't make sense, right? So I guess it's so hard for me to see why people who consider themselves to be frequentists would be against something like that. For me, again, this is the more intuitive part of Bayesianism. It seems like it makes sense. Like if somebody were to tell me, like hypothetically, and our friend Liz is going to kill me, but if let's say she were to say like, hey, here's proof of aliens, I'd be like, probably not.
Yeah, exactly. So like I live in North London. You get a lot of foxes in North London. They keep going through our bins. You don't get a lot of zebras, So if my friend were to say to me, I saw a fox in your front garden, I would say, fine, okay. I don't know. I'm happy to update my beliefs, that there was, to accept there was a fox in my front garden this morning, last night, whatever. If they said there was a zebra, I would assume they'd gone mad or they were lying to me, because even though the strength of the evidence is the same, my friend tells me, my prior belief, and it's how we work with everything, right? Actually, in reality, you are right. It's how humans work. We get some new information and we add it to the information we already have. Like we would never go, a zebra in my front garden, you say, fantastic. All right, I'm definitely going to believe that. You would obviously go, yeah. And then maybe if you went out into your front garden and there was a zebra eating your petunias, you would be, okay, now I have very strong evidence. I update my belief towards this being true. Right, but it would take some really strong evidence of the order of you literally seeing the zebra before you're going to believe that, right? Or maybe loads, you see, I don't know, loads of people telling you there's a news report, or I don't know, maybe photos, whatever. And that's just how we work. And I agree with you. I think that scientists obviously do this when they're doing, because the frequentist model, it's true that they sort of don't include the priors in the statistics they do. But obviously they don't go and research, well, sometimes they do, and that's a problem because of using frequentist models. But most of the time, principal scientists don't go and research completely crazy things because they have a Bayesian prior that this thing, that isn't going to be true. They don't go and research perpetual motion machines or, I don't know, alchemy, turning lead into gold, whatever, unless they're nuclear physicists, I suppose. But they don't, because they go, well, I have a very strong belief this won't happen, and you use these, they do have these subjective priors built on experience of the world, which they then do or don't use, and that's that's fine. But they sort of then say, but I won't use those numbers in my statistics formally. I'll just use them sort of informally to guide my research. That was what one frequentist told me for the book, which is, it's completely fine. Like that is fine. I agree with you that there's a sort of more. There's a feels like, firstly, it's more intuitive. Admitting that some things are more likely or less likely beforehand is just sort of a bit more honest with yourself, and also has a sort of neatness to it. And like I don't know, and I do find it sort of, let's pretend that we're being completely objective and there's only this information here and we have to throw away all the information we've got before. And I think it becomes a problem sometimes when people, I mean, a common, I'm sure this is the same in the States, but I feel like here, every couple of weeks there's a study comes out that says red wine is good for you or bad for you this week.
We have the same issue.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, whatever is it? Christ's
Coffee
sake,
too.
Yeah, coffee, eggs, whatever. Is it good for me or bad for me this week? And if every single new study comes in, and obviously each study is there's random noise in it. It won't give exactly the right answer study, because the studies are carried out in different ways on different people. They have just, people have different results to different things on different days, whatever. They just, there's noise in the studies and they won't all come back saying exact same thing. So they can just vary a bit enough to say, oh, this week red wine prevents cancer. This week it causes cancer, whatever. And if all we're doing is looking at that one study, then each week we're going, oh, well, the last one's updated, the last one's been superseded now. This new one tells me this thing, this new one tells me this thing, this new one tells me this thing. And we never have a stable belief in the world, and that's not helpful. What you should do is add that information to all the existing information you already had, the hundreds and hundreds of studies saying red wine probably doesn't really have much impact at all at low levels. It might have a very slight protective effect at very low levels, but probably that's, it's all like, you can just sort of have your prior of like, there's loads of data here already. It all shows sort of the same thing noisily around the middle of it. Like, yeah, at low levels, drinking doesn't seem to have very much effect at all, tiny effect, positive or negative. And then if you drink loads and loads, it's probably quite bad for you, and that's, I mean, if you drink loads and loads, it definitely is quite bad for you. But that's just how we should, and in most cases do operate. Like we are happy adding new information to information we already had. So yeah, it is only in science that we feel like, new study comes out, completely overturns everything we already believed. Now I have to believe something totally new. And that's not good. That's not good practice, epistemic practice. It leads you down some bad, lets you get blown around by the wind in this silly way. And it's not true. Like, so the latest study is not necessarily better than the 500 studies that came before. So you need to add it to, it's just one more data point in the huge body of evidence that already exists. And I think that's a much healthier way of looking at it, and that's much more Bayesian as well.
Yeah,
I'm probably thinking about this incorrectly, and please feel free to educate me on this. But couldn't Bayesian statistics be dangerous from the perspective of, and when I use the word dangerous, I'm just using it lightly, but couldn't it, if, let's say, depending on your prior, couldn't that influence what evidence it is that you look for to support that prior? And then by way of maybe sophistry or just being clever, you could sort of bring someone to maybe believing that the prior is true if you find enough evidence to support that prior.
Wait,
so
before
you want to answer that? I'll let Leon go first.
No, I don't want to answer it. I actually want to ask you for an example, because I was literally thinking this exact same thing. It's so wild how we're like on the same wavelength. If you're okay with sharing the story. So Alan has, we're not going to get into like names and stuff, but Alan has two friends, right? So in this case,
well done.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
So this is so I mean, even though it's obviously still ongoing, this was at the height of Israel Palestine, right? So Alan told the story because you already shared it on the podcast, so I'm assuming we could get into it. We don't have to if you don't want to, right? So but Alan shared the story about how, and so he didn't say it exactly this way, but this is, I want to get your perspective on this and how you're thinking about it going further, right? So we had two different people that he spoke about with two different priors, right? So obviously one was hyper pro Israel and the other one was hyper pro Palestine. These people sort of disconnected or whatever, but the point is to say that they had very different priors. And remember how you talked about how those priors essentially influenced the way that they viewed the data, right? And how kind of let's say, I was going to say not necessarily standoffish, that's not the right way to do, but kind of how rigid they were in their thinking. And this, I think, connects to what you were just saying.
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, based on them already having that inclination to be, either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, the statistics that then, or the news they then looked at, went to support, that particular perspective. And yeah, then they ended up, just each person thinking they were completely and utterly correct.
Yeah.
And yeah,
With the
It's
same data,
yeah.
that was the thing. We all have the same data, right? Well, tell me. Yeah.
it's not, I mean, that you're getting into murky waters when you say you have the same data. I
Mhm.
don't know. It depends what news source you're listening to. It
Mhm.
depends on how much your attention span also, I guess, looking at the data. What are you paying attention to from the data that's being presented? Maybe you just zone in on things that
Mhm.
support your inclination. I mean, say you have a pro Israel stance, and then you're looking at hostages or what happened October 7th, and then you kind of concentrate on news depicting the horror of that particular thing. And also, I'm not trying to belittle it, just
No, of
in
course.
general, somebody will pay attention to that, and you may be presented with other information, but maybe you're just going to kind of zone in on that. And someone who's pro-Palestine, they're gonna be like, no, like, okay, they're gonna be not triggered, but they're gonna focus on words like, okay, genocide, collateral damage, um, families just, like
Murdered babies. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so like, funnily enough, this was it reminds me of a thing I did like 20 years ago now, my master's degree about in ethics, and there was the Israel Palestine even then was a case study. It was a book I read called Through Different Eyes, and it was how like two really educated, I think it was a Jewish American or Israeli American like senator or something, and this equally like a academic Palestinian American guy, and they're both writing about the fighting at the time, and they were both saying like they would both report the same incidents and say, but and see one as like one would say this was an outrage provocation, the other would say no, that was a retaliation for some previous thing, and they just saw the same facts through totally different lenses. It was very, I mean, here we are, how many decades later, and it was, it's fascinating and sad, the whole thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's two responses to the on the one level. In theory, if you are a good Bayesian, you cannot go out and seek evidence for your hypothesis, because if you see stuff that doesn't surprise you, it shouldn't change. The point of a Bayesian updating, right, is if you get new information that just fits what you already predicted, then that doesn't change your prior. You already believe what you already predicted what you see it, your beliefs don't change. So it's only if you see something you really don't expect that your beliefs should change a lot. So that means while you can go out and seek as much information as you like for things you expect to see, but it'll just mean keep telling you that it'll just keep changing your beliefs, and then proportionately it'll change a lot more if you ever see something you don't expect. So on average, in expectation, new information should be just as likely to shift you away from your prior as towards it. That's a sort of mathematical truth about it. And obviously we're not actually all good Bayesians, and we do all like allow ourselves to be secretly to secretly confirmation bias and all that sort of stuff. But there's a slightly more sort of more subtle but interesting thing, which is that we're sort of imagining there's only two hypotheses. There's either, I don't know, this politician, Israel Palestine or whatever. But if there's there's a third hypothesis. So like the example I give in the book is of, I think it's of vaccine skeptics. And if you're really sure that the vaccines are cause autism, whatever, then in theory, if the chances are either if someone shows you some scientific evidence that that they don't, I mean, like in the UK, the MMR vaccine was introduced in 1992 or something like that, and if vaccines caused autism, you'd expect to see a big spike of autism. You don't. It doesn't. For me, it's very convincing evidence. For someone who really strongly believes that vaccines do cause autism, if those were the only two hypotheses, that either vaccines cause autism or this scientific study is true, then that scientific study will have to shift. Will have to shift their beliefs away from it. But there's actually a third hypothesis, that the scientific establishment is lying to me. So it can, instead of shifting your probability mass onto your sort of probability distribution onto away from the vaccines thing and onto the scientific establishment is true and good, it can shift a lot of it onto I'm being lied to by the mainstream media. I'm being lied to by this. So you have these competing things, and it becomes very difficult for people with very strong priors on some particular subject. And it's easy to point it out when we're talking about people with what we would consider very obviously wrong beliefs, like vaccine skepticism. But it's the really interesting bit is when we're talking about beliefs that are closer to home, I think, and it's very hard to tell when you're in a situation like this. But I think that was that's how you can sort of see with conspiracy theories and with these entrenched differences, exactly like you're saying. Maybe they did have exactly the same data about Israel Palestine, but they had different priors, and so then it shifts one of them. It shifts to them, but it shifts them both to believe some third hypothesis, like the media is lying to me.
Right.
Rather than shifting them towards each other on seeing, like, I've seen all these horrible pictures of murders and. Or I literally cannot bring myself to think about a lot of it because it's so horrible. But so it's possible they both see the same evidence, but because they have these very different priors, it shifts them onto different explanations that the other one wouldn't go near. So it is a possible thing to happen.
Yeah. This reminds me, I remember from, I think this was now 2014, where they had the debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham, who was like the I guess
creationist guy,
the proprietor of the Creationist Museum. And so I remember Ken Ham starts the debate, and he says something like, he's like, well, so Bill Nye and I, we both have the same data and we both have the same evidence, but we draw very different conclusions. And I'm thinking, wait, how the fuck do you have the same evidence and you draw different? Like, how is that even possible? But yeah, and so for those who even want to watch the debate, it's about like 3 hours or whatever it was, 3 to 4 hours. But like, he actually, he actually found a way to take the fossil record and fit it into a creationist perspective. And I was like, this is actually kind of brilliant. I got to give it to him. I was like, holy shit, he actually fit. So narratives, right? This is what I'm really getting into, right? So can we talk about now how narratives also, I mean, we kind of got into it with the priors, right? But particularly about how narratives actually cause us to incorporate our data. Because essentially what he did was he took the fossil record, which I mean, from my understanding, it more so is geared toward and kind of more so supports evolutionary theory. But the thing is, for him, he took that and he supported his own narrative, which is the creationist perspective, right? So how do narratives play into all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of this brilliant one, again, from my philosophy undergraduate, that when all the fossils were first being found in like the early Victorian era, and people were like, what are these things? These like fossils of dragons and stuff that don't fit in with the God's like the idea that God made everything, and so that everything is unchanging. And someone, I can't remember his name, like Edward Goss or something like that, came up with this like, it was kind of beautiful. Like, they put in there to test your faith. And if you, it's all God trying to trick you, and if you fall for the trick, then you don't believe in God strongly enough, and you should be. And he wrote a whole book on it. But this is, and yeah, I mean, that was, you could say that is very much someone with such a, I just cannot, I'm not willing to have my belief change this, because it's so important to me that I will build, frankly, crazy towers of belief around it to avoid having to go for the simplest explanation. Yeah. And it is building a narrative. It's exactly what it is. It's like you've got the nice simple one straight line story of, there were different creatures years ago, they died out and replaced by different creatures, and that's just, there's a sort, it's complicated and strange, but it's not difficult. Like, it's just these things just, or you have to say these fossils were buried to make it look as though God made as though the universe existed 6 million or 100 million or hundreds of millions of years ago, but actually God made them 6,000 years ago, and he included all the stuff to hide it, to sort of trick you, so that you would be forced to be even more devout in your faith. And it's like you're doing handsprings, like doing crazy. And it is building narratives to protect your fundamental belief. And I could do the whole, this is a Bayesian thing. Your prior is so very strong that you are forced to find new hypotheses, however crazy they are. I mean, to some extent, I feel I'd be sort of shoehorning it in, and then actually at some point you just got to say, your epistemic model is broken down completely. These guys are having, they're just freaking out because the world is not fitting to their liking. And it was, the Ken Ham thing. I remember didn't he say that bananas were evidence of.
Yes. And by the way, and his belief was literally because a banana fits perfectly into the palm of your hand.
It peels, and it's got the antiseptic,
yeah.
But like, we've been breeding bananas for centuries. And
Mhm.
you know, if you see a wild banana, it doesn't look like that.
Yeah.
That is not what a wild banana looks like. Anyway, but yeah, so you're right. It is. I mean, and I guess if I start saying this as Bayesian priors and stuff, it is a slightly formalized way of saying it is just we build narratives to protect ourselves, to protect our beliefs, because when it's a belief we just don't want to change.
Yeah. Yeah. So the point that you're making, and I really want to drill this home for our podcast listeners, is essentially Bayesianism isn't purely subjective. There are some beliefs that are more absurd and some priors that are more absurd than others. So we're not exactly saying that we can say our priors are completely based on concrete evidence, obviously, because we don't have enough data to say that. However, they're more or less rational. They're not exactly somebody saying, well, yes, there's a high probability that, I don't know, ghosts are real or something along those lines.
Yeah. I mean, there are better and worse. But okay, here's the way I would say it. Beliefs are better or worse insofar as they successfully predict the world, right? Like if I think it is not objectively true that things always fall down or whatever, you know, but it is just, it tends to happen more often than not, a lot more often than not. So you can confidently predict, if I pick up my watch on this table and drop it again, it'll drop down, right? That is, if you were to, if you were to say, I don't, you know, it's all subjective, you could believe anything you like. I say, all right, fine, I will bet you £20 that when I pick up this watch and drop it, it'll drop. And if you genuinely thought beliefs were totally, you know, that subjective beliefs were totally anything goes, and it's just all postmodern and we can believe anything we like and there is no truth, then in theory you would say, yes, I do not believe that the future will be, you know, the future will be like the past. I do not believe that there is any reason to think that things fall down. So I'll take that bet and then I'd be 20 quid richer, right? So it is, but nonetheless, it is just it is just my subjective belief. It is just me saying, I've seen most things that are heavy and stay on the ground. I've seen them fall down. I know how gravity works insofar as, you know, well, I'm not pretending I know what quantum gravity is, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean. I can sort of, I've seen how it works. I understand that it is a thing that attracts massive bodies. I'm very confident in this belief, and that if I were to make that bet, I would be confident that I would win it. And I think that is true in all sorts of things. And you can make guesses that are less confident. Like I could predict that the world's population will carry on growing to the middle of the 21st century. I'm fairly confident in that, you know, and it'll start to decline after that. But like, this is noisy. It's a long way away. There's, you know, demographics is, you know, things change, like memes spread between different people, and who knows what will actually happen. There could be a war, you know.
Right.
So, but the point is, we are as humans, right? As living beings, we're trying to survive in the world, and we can survive in the world best by successfully predicting the world and successfully predicting what our actions will do in the world. So if I want to go and get, I don't know, milk from the shop, I need to predict, will the shop have it? I need to predict, will I have enough money to pay? You know, it's just will me moving my feet one after the other successfully get me there, or like anything, and any decision-making agent in the world is trying to predict the world and is trying to predict what its actions will do. And insofar as it makes good predictions, it'll do well. And that's not, it's subjective. And there's, you know, no one can tell it there's no like right or wrong exactly. There's no sort of one truth, but there is whether or not we do better in the world. And like, I think that is sort of the big insight of Bayesianism, or one of the many big insights of Bayesianism, is that the beliefs are predictions, that those beliefs are better or worse insofar as they successfully predict the world. And then like that can still be subjective, but it doesn't mean just made up. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't mean made up. It means that it can be successful or unsuccessful. I think that's the difference.
Yeah, and then so like as we start wrapping up, I do want to ask one of our final questions. So what I do want to ask is going back to scientific studies, right? Somebody who's, let's say, either a layperson or somebody just has, let's say, maybe a basic understanding of it, they might say something along the lines of like, okay, but let's say if we're looking at the data and we're looking at studies, and you know, you mentioned the wine example, I obviously mentioned coffee, and it's like the question is going to be there: how is it possible that something is published, peer reviewed, and considered to be statistically significant, meaning p minus 0.05? Right.
Yeah.
So how is it possible that that's published and that's considered evidence? And again, it's considered to be non-random in the way that most people would think about it, but yet it contradicts another study that is considered to be the same thing.
Yeah. Well, this happens because the p less than 0.05 thing is laughably weak. So for your listeners who don't know what statistical significance mean, like if you imagine when we say something is statistically significant, we mean that it's something you would expect to see by chance if the hypothesis you're looking for, so like, you know, red wine causes cancer or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
If you would expect to see it by chance less than 1 time in 20, that's what statistically significant means. So if I were to roll two, if I had my hypothesis, these dice are loaded, I roll the dice, I get 2 6s, I'd only see that 1 time in 36. That's better. That's p equals like 1.0.015 or so. I can't read it. That's less. That's well less than statistical significance. And so I could get that my dice rolling paper published in Nature, maybe, you know, and that's just laughably weak evidence. It's not. And so what will happen is, and what that literally means is, if you do 20 studies on for something, if you do 20 studies into whatever, do jelly beans cause cancer, you know, and you take 20 groups of 1,000 people and see which ones eat the most jelly bean, you know, then you'll expect to see one statistically significant result just by chance, because that's what it means. It means it's the equivalent of, it's the chance of seeing something, but it's something you expect to see by chance only 1 time in 20. So if you've got a scientific like body of literature, which we do, of many thousands of studies, you'll get a lot of false positives. There'll be a lot of them that will just be not true. And that is, in fact, you know, this has been the great discovery. I mean, you work in psych by the sound of things, so like you'll be aware of the replication crisis and the whole, all these things we thought we believed in 2011, they turn out not to be true. You know, half of the studies that when people going back and try and replicate them, they're just not true because they were noise mining. They were just coincidences that we turned into scientific papers, you know, and that has meant that people are getting more aware of that nowadays. But I think like this is another area where if you were a bit Bayesian about it, you would, I hope, be a bit more skeptical. Like there were a lot of studies that came out in the 90s and 2000s in psych in particular, which, I mean, were kind of crazy. Like there was one, I'm sure I'm sure I'm not misremembering this, that they asked people to like answer questions on a questionnaire, and they found that they were more likely to answer those questions in a suspicious way, as in like, I don't trust this guy or whatever, if there was a smell of fish in the room, because it smells fishy. And like, well, I mean, you're just making this is crap. I mean, I just don't believe this is true, right? Like, you know, and lo and behold, it doesn't replicate. People are you know, it turns out that they've just got a 1 in 20 coincidence and they published it, and you can chop your data up in loads of ways. So that's what's happening, and I think it's a real problem with science, especially with psych, but also in medicine. Economics has its own problems, sociology, all these different things. They are just finding that a lot of the stuff that they did when they weren't aware of how easy it is to get false positives is turning out to be complete crap. And if you were Bayesian about it and said, I don't believe, you know, this seems on the face of it really unlikely, then this smells bloody fishy to me. You know, then you would be less likely to publish what turns out to be complete crap, because you would have a higher bar of skepticism, or at least that's the hope. Obviously, there's all sorts of incentive structure problems in science which lead people to publishing loads of crap because they need to get stuff published, otherwise they don't progress in their careers. And that's a whole subject for a whole other podcast, which I could go on about at incredible length, and I won't. But yeah, but I think that's how, because the reason 2 studies can completely contradict each other on apparently fundamental points is because at least one of them is complete crap and made up. What
you're ultimately saying, just like again for the lay audience, is that if it's, let's say hypothetically, you know, based on the P, if it's a 1 in 20 chance, then fundamentally with thousands upon thousands of studies, it's just going to be littered with these false positives.
Yes, or even like more than that, right? Imagine I get a data set. People have definitely done this. A guy lost his job for doing this, but imagine I get a data set and it's got loads of, you know, and it's like, I don't know, say like a big survey of tens of thousands of Americans about, you know, their eating habits, their sleeping habits, how often they use the toilet every day, I don't know, their height, their weight, whatever. If I go, I wonder if people who are taller use the toilet more often. I look at it and I no, okay, no correlation there. I'll do it again. I do that, and how about people with larger shoe size? Do they breathe more slowly? Okay, no, whatever. And I check dozens and dozens of correlations, and oh look, I've done 20 of them. Oh, one of them comes up with and then I publish that one. Well, I'm going to see a coincidence one time in 20. That's what it means.
Yeah.
So yeah. So and then you don't tell anyone that you tested the other 19. You publish that one. The other 19 never make it into the scientific literature, and you have then got yourself a paper in whatever journal, and you can say, look, I've got published, and I now I'm a published research author and things. And that genuinely happens all the time, and it pollutes the scientific record with all sorts of crap. And yeah, again, I said I wasn't going to rant about it. I seem to have just ranted about it for 5 minutes, but it's honestly,
okay.
it's a huge problem for science. Huge problem.
Well, and this is even when the expectation from peer-reviewed journals is to submit all of your data, or is it?
No, it's getting better. It's getting better these days. That there is that a lot of journals do say we need to have data access. A lot of them, they say like data available on request, and then scientists stonewall it. But even if the data is all available on request, that coincidence will have been real. What's important is that before you got before you got the data, if you said, I think that people with larger feet will use the toilet more often, whatever my stupid example was before, they if you say that's the thing I'm testing, and you go and test it, and then you come out, then there's only a 1 in 20 chance you'll get that one, that see a coincidence, a 1 in 20 coincidence that time. So to some extent, you can say, all right, there's only a 1 in 20 chance I'll see this false positive. You shouldn't see that many in that situation. But if you are allowed to secretly go and do loads and loads of different tests on lots of different correlations within the data, and then not tell anyone, then you can do it. You can easily get a 1 in 20 coincidence just by doing lots of tests, and then you publish the one that you did that does come up by coincidence. And I don't know, did you in the book, I think I mentioned, you may not have got to this bit, but there's a bit. These guys wanted to demonstrate this, and they got a bunch of people to listen to When I'm 64 by the Beatles, and another bunch of people to listen to, I think it was Kalimba by Mr. Scruff, which is a control piece of the intervention in the control. And they found that the people who listened to When I'm 64 got younger, as in were younger. So they were able to say, look, we can prove P equals less than 0.05, that people who listen to When I'm 64 by the Beatles, their birthday becomes more recent. They get younger. And obviously, that's not true, right? That is logic. I think it's fair to say logically impossible. So, and what they'd done was they'd taken two small samples of people, asked them a whole bunch of questions. When you listen to this music, when you are you nostalgic for the past? Do you miss the good old days? Are you socially conservative? Ask them dozens and dozens of questions, and then checked for different correlations between different things, and found, oh, brilliant, this one's come up. And they publish it in things saying, look how easily I can get bullshit results from the completely bog standard methods of science that were entirely normal to use then and still are. And there are ways around. You could pre-register your hypotheses. You can say in advance, this is the one thing I'm going to go and look for, and nothing else. And if that doesn't come back, then I've given it my best shot. And there are, you can make your data available to everyone. You can do all these things, but it's not standard practice. And this is why a lot of science goes wrong, and a lot of it is complete crap. And that is, it is genuinely bad. It is genuinely bad. I mean, it's bad because it makes people believe wrong things. It's bad because it wastes huge amounts of taxpayers and university money and chasing after pointless hypotheses that aren't true. And it's something I've written about a lot about over the last several years. So people are starting to get better at introducing, like, requiring pre-registration, requiring data, open data, and all that sort of stuff. But it is, it's a mess, and it's only slowly getting better.
And just curious, so when somebody would pre-register their hypothesis, what would happen? Would it be, let's say, kind of more rigid in terms of the standard for data or data collection?
No. So what they do is for example, if we're doing the big people with big feet using the toilet, I come up with these mad examples, and then I find I'm stuck with them. But they do that, and you've got this massive data set, and they say when they start doing, before they look at the data, they submit their pre-registration to the journal or to a pre-registration site, and say, this is how I'm going to do this experiment. I'm going to go and collect data in this way. I'm going to examine it for this particular thing. And then it does reduce your chance of, because you're only looking for one You're only giving yourself one chance of a coincidence.
Right.
In theory, there's only a 1 in 20 chance that you'd see the coincidence that by the wrong answer in a false positive. So
Right.
you just write it down in advance and hope, and then that makes it less likely that you're going to trick yourself, basically.
Right.
or
Right.
trick
Rather
other
than
people.
find some correlation after the fact.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than just dig through the data, chopping up. If you imagine you sort of get the big data set and you just chop it up as many ways as you can until you find something, and you will find something. Like if you do, I don't know, sports data is the classic. People always do this. This is the first time the Redskins have won. Do they still call the Redskins? I don't know.
No, Commanders.
No. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I got myself in trouble.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know, the LA Raiders, the first time they've won on a Wednesday, in the third Wednesday in November or whatever. Since yeah, okay, that's fine, but that tells me nothing. So you've chopped it up until you found some weird little data fact. It's the same thing in science, and it becomes it renders a lot of the stuff really unhelpful and kind of useless.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right, Alan, final questions for Tom as we wrap up.
Yes, if we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Sure. Tom Chivers on Twitter. So X, Jesus. X.com/Twitter / Tom Chivers.
Yeah.
Jesus. That's where my most online place. I work for Semafor, which is it's not far from you guys, based in New York, and I work for I do their morning newsletter in London. So that's, if you go to semafor.com/newsletters, you'll find flagship one that's written by me and my colleagues, and we think it's really useful and it gives you a decent roundup of sort of the most important and interesting news that you need that day. As you mentioned, I've written 3 books now. The most recent one, Everything is Predictable, you can find it on Amazon. It's probably easiest to go Everything is Predictable Tom Chivers in Google and you'll find it. And yeah, me and my friend Stuart Richie run a podcast together called The Studies Show. We're quite proud of that. It's like The Studies Show, but the Studies Show. Anyway, and it's basically what we've just been talking about. It's a lot of like, let's just look at the evidence for some topic. I mean, I don't know. We did what's some things we did recently? We did the impact of lead on IQ. We did oh god, I'm blanking. We did Ozempic, we did vaping. What's the evidence for the health benefits and risks and all that sort of stuff, and just trying to do the really virtuous thing of actually looking, rather than being led by media reports and things, just looking at the studies. Stuart in particular is really good at this because he's ex academia. I've been a science writer for a long time, so I've sort of got the hang of it, and we just look at the evidence and do our best to understand it and sometimes get it right. And I think it's pretty funny and good. So do come and check us out. It's thestudiesshowpod.com, and we're on Substack.
Yeah, and what I love about all of this so much, and I mean in particular, obviously your work, Tom, is how practical and how necessary a lot of this stuff is. Because I would say, even for me with the graduate level of understanding, even though I'm technically not a statistician, but I do have a graduate level of knowledge of statistics, supposedly. So a lot of this stuff is really hard for us to understand, and I love the way you break it down. And I felt like a lot of what you said on the show was, again, super necessary, relevant, and also digestible. Thank you so much for your work, man. This was such an excellent show.
Oh, that's really cool. Thank you very much, guys. I really enjoyed it.
All right, Tom. Take care. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Talk to you soon.
All right. So everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On Twitter, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.